When a wealthy widow's secrets collide with betrayal and greed, the results are deadly. Why did a trusted sheriff meet his end at the hands of his own wife? And how did their tangled web of lies begin? Eleanor Price, a woman of grace and quiet power, sat at her mahogany desk, eyes locked on a letter clutched tightly in her trembling hands. At 45, with piercing green eyes and auburn hair streaked with silver, Eleanor was known for her calm demeanor. But tonight, her face was pale and fear flickered behind her eyes. She was no stranger to loss. Her husband, Charles Price, had passed away a year earlier under mysterious circumstances, leaving her a fortune and the weight of suspicion. Now this letter, anonymous and cryptic, threatened to unravel everything. It read, "You aren't as innocent as you pretend to be. Meet me at midnight, alone." No signature, just an address in the darkest part of town. Eleanor arrived, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. The warehouse loomed, silent and foreboding. She stepped inside, the air thick with mildew and tension. The only light came from a flickering bulb swinging from the ceiling. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, lean, with a smirk that never reached his cold blue eyes. Michael Reeves, her secret lover. They had been careful, too careful, Eleanor thought. But here he was, the man who had once whispered promises, now staring at her with a predatory smile. "You're late, Eleanor," Michael drawled, his voice dripping with disdain. "Why are we here?" Eleanor demanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Michael stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "It's simple. I know everything about Charles, about how you made sure his accident happened. And now I want my share." Eleanor's blood turned cold. She had trusted him, confided in him, but she should have known better. Michael always had his own agenda. "This isn't you, Michael," she whispered, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Oh, it is," he sneered. "It's always been me. You just didn't want to see it." October 6th. Eleanor barely slept. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside her mind raged on. Michael's threats echoed in her ears. He wanted half of her fortune, or he'd go to the authorities with evidence of her involvement in Charles' death. There was no way out, unless she created one. As the sun rose, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't let Michael destroy everything. She needed a plan, one that would ensure her survival and his silence forever. That afternoon, she met with her attorney, Daniel West, a sharp, no-nonsense man who had served the Price family for years. She spoke vaguely of new threats and asked about tightening her assets, shielding them from any sudden claims. Daniel nodded, unaware of the true depth of her predicament. But Michael was one step ahead. That evening, Eleanor received a package at her door. Inside was a cassette tape, a recording of their private conversations, proof of her guilt. Attached was a note, "Time's running out, darling." The pressure mounted. Eleanor felt trapped, like a cornered animal. She needed to end this, and she knew exactly how. October 8th. Eleanor arranged a meeting with Michael at a remote lodge just outside town. She played her part well, feigning compliance, promising him the money he demanded. He arrived confident, unaware of the danger that awaited him. The lodge was quiet, the air tense. Eleanor poured them both a drink, her hands steady. "To new beginnings," she said, forcing a smile. Michael raised his glass, but never saw the glint of steel Eleanor had concealed beneath the table. In one swift motion, she lunged, the knife slicing through the air. But Michael was quicker than she anticipated. He twisted, grabbing her wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. They struggled, the room echoing with the sounds of a desperate fight. Years of suppressed rage and betrayal boiled over. Michael's grip tightened around Eleanor's throat. "You thought you could kill me," he hissed. Summoning every ounce of strength, Eleanor clawed at his face, breaking free just long enough to grab the fallen knife. With a final, desperate thrust, she plunged it into his chest. Michael gasped, eyes wide in shock, before collapsing to the ground. Blood pooled around him, the life draining from his body. Breathing hard, Eleanor stared at the man who had once been her lover, now a lifeless reminder of her desperation. She wiped her hands, knowing this wasn't over. Michael's death would raise questions, and she needed answers, ones that kept her out of prison. October 9th. Eleanor stood over Michael's lifeless body, her mind racing. Every second counted. She wiped the knife clean and discarded it in a nearby creek, careful not to leave a trace. She dragged Michael's body into the lodge's basement, covering him with a tarp and debris. It was a temporary solution, but she needed time to think. She returned home as the sun rose, washing away the blood and changing clothes. To anyone who saw her, she was a grieving widow going about her day. But inside, every nerve was frayed, every movement calculated. She had survived one night, but more challenges loomed ahead. October 10th. The news broke quickly. Michael Reeves was missing. Rumors swirled in Cedar Pines, and the police began a preliminary search. Eleanor maintained her composure, knowing any misstep could expose her. She was greeted at her door by Sheriff Tom Willis, a friend of the late Charles Price. His eyes were kind, but his questions were sharp. "Mrs. Price," the sheriff began, "I understand you were close with Michael Reeves." Eleanor nodded, her face a mask of controlled grief. "He helped me manage some affairs after Charles passed. We were friends." Sheriff Willis studied her, sensing more beneath the surface. "Did he mention any plans to leave town?" "No," Eleanor lied effortlessly. "He was always unpredictable, though." The sheriff nodded, but didn't press further. As he left, Eleanor realized he wasn't convinced. She needed to be careful. Sheriff Willis was thorough, and his loyalty to her late husband would make him relentless. October 12th. That evening, Eleanor met with Daniel West again. This time, she spoke in cryptic terms, hinting at threats and possible legal complications. Daniel, ever the loyal attorney, assured her that her assets were protected. But Eleanor could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Did he suspect more than he let on? The pressure intensified when a note arrived at Eleanor's door. This one wasn't from Michael. It read, "I know what you did." No signature, no clues, just a chilling reminder that someone was watching. October 14th. Unable to ignore the threat, Eleanor returned to the lodge. She needed to ensure there were no loose ends, but as she approached the basement, dread pooled in her stomach. Michael's body was gone. Panic clawed at her chest. She searched frantically, finding only a trail of blood leading outside. In the darkness, a figure emerged. It was Daniel West. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "I had to know, Eleanor," he said, voice trembling. "I followed you that night. I saw everything." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "What did you do?" "Michael was still alive when I found him," Daniel confessed, his eyes haunted. "Barely. He told me everything before he died." Rage and fear warred within Eleanor. "Why didn't you come to me?" "I wanted to help you," Daniel said, stepping closer. "But it's too late. Others know. If we don't act now, we're both finished." Eleanor felt the walls closing in. "Who knows?" Daniel hesitated, then spoke a name that made Eleanor's blood run cold: Sheriff Willis. October 15th. Eleanor and Daniel hatched a desperate plan. They needed to eliminate any evidence linking them to Michael's death. That meant dealing with Sheriff Willis. As they plotted, doubt crept into Eleanor's mind. How much could she trust Daniel? His loyalty was now a dangerous asset. But there was no turning back. That night, Eleanor placed a call to the sheriff, asking him to meet her at the estate. "I need your help," she said. her voice carefully trembling. "I'm scared." Sheriff Willis arrived, his eyes wary but sympathetic. "What's this about, Eleanor?" "It's about Michael," she said, her words slow and measured. "There are things I need to tell you." As she spoke, Daniel appeared from the shadows, a pistol in his hand. The sheriff's eyes widened, realization dawning. "You've gone too far, Eleanor." "Drop it, Tom," Daniel ordered, his voice shaking. "We don't want to hurt you." The sheriff stared at Eleanor, betrayal etched into his face. "You were like family." "Please, Tom," Eleanor pleaded. "Just listen." But it was too late. Sheriff Willis lunged, knocking the gun from Daniel's hand. A struggle ensued, the room filled with the sounds of fists and shattered glass. Eleanor watched, frozen, as the two men fought for control. Daniel managed to grab a shard of glass, slashing at the sheriff. Blood spattered the floor. Sheriff Willis fell back, clutching his wound. "You won't get away with this," he gasped. Eleanor stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Tom." Daniel raised the pistol again, his hand steadier this time. "This ends now." The gunshot echoed through the estate, silencing everything. October 16th. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Sheriff Tom Willis lay lifeless on the cold marble floor. Eleanor stared down at him, her mind numb. This was not how it was supposed to go. Daniel stood beside her, his breathing ragged, the gun still clutched in his trembling hands. "What now?" Eleanor whispered, her voice hollow. Daniel's eyes were wild, darting around as if looking for a solution. "We clean this up, just like before." "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "This is different. He was the sheriff." "That's why we don't have a choice," Daniel snapped. "If anyone finds out, we're done." Eleanor's heart pounded. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in. She nodded reluctantly, unable to see any other way out. They worked quickly, wrapping the sheriff's body in heavy fabric and cleaning up the blood. Every movement felt mechanical, detached from the horror of what they were doing. By dawn, they had loaded the body into Daniel's car. Eleanor watched as he drove away, the weight of their actions pressing down on her like a crushing tide. October 17th. News of Sheriff Willis's disappearance spread fast. The town was in shock. Eleanor played the role of the concerned friend, her grief convincing, but inside she was crumbling. Every glance, every whisper felt like a dagger aimed at her heart. Daniel was becoming increasingly paranoid. He called Eleanor late at night, his voice frantic. "They're watching me," he said. "I can feel it." "You need to stay calm," Eleanor replied, though she was far from calm herself. "We can't draw attention." But Daniel was spiraling. He started making mistakes, leaving traces of blood on his clothes, talking too much when he'd had a drink. Eleanor realized he was a liability. If he broke, everything would come crashing down. October 20th. Eleanor invited Daniel over under the pretense of discussing their next steps. He arrived tense and jumpy. She poured him a drink, watching as his hands shook. "We need to think carefully," she said, keeping her tone calm. "No more mistakes." Daniel nodded, taking a long drink. "I know, I'm not sleeping." Eleanor leaned closer. "Maybe you need to rest, clear your mind." He looked at her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "Nothing," she replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just that you need to be strong." Daniel's gaze hardened. "You think I'm weak, that I'm going to ruin everything?" Eleanor's pulse quickened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," he snapped, standing abruptly. "I see it in your eyes." "Daniel, please," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "We're in this together." "Not anymore," he said, turning away. "I'm done." As he walked toward the door, Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't let him leave, Not like this. "Wait!" she called, her voice desperate. Daniel paused, but before she could say anything else, he opened the door and walked out. Panic surged through her. If he talked, everything would be over. October 21st. Eleanor followed Daniel through the winding forest roads, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had become a threat, a loose end that needed to be tied. She hated herself for what she was about to do, but there was no choice. She watched as Daniel parked his car near an old, abandoned cabin. He stepped out, glancing nervously around before disappearing inside. Eleanor took a deep breath and followed. The cabin was dark, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Eleanor stepped carefully, her footsteps muffled by the rotting floorboards. She found Daniel sitting in the corner, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, a revolver in the other. "Why are you here?" he slurred, his eyes unfocused. "I want to make things right," Eleanor said softly, inching closer. He laughed bitterly. "There's no making this right." "Maybe there is," she said, her voice low. "If we stick together." Daniel's grip on the revolver tightened. "You're lying. You always lie." Eleanor took another step. "Please, Daniel, we can fix this." "Too late," he whispered, raising the gun. Time seemed to slow. Eleanor lunged, knocking the revolver from his hand. They struggled, their movements frantic and clumsy. In the chaos, the revolver discharged, the bullet shattering a window. Birds scattered into the night, their cries echoing in the darkness. Eleanor managed to wrestle the gun away, her chest heaving. She stood over Daniel, who lay on the floor, his face pale and defeated. "Do it," he spat, his voice raw. "End it." Eleanor hesitated, tears streaming down her face. She had come so far, done so much. But could she cross this final line? The answer came not from her, but from the shadows. A figure stepped forward, Sheriff Willis's deputy, Mark Tanner. He had been following them for days, piecing together the puzzle. "It's over, Eleanor," Mark said, his voice steady. "Drop the gun." Eleanor's hands shook. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," Mark replied, his eyes cold. "Put it down." She lowered the gun, her strength leaving her. Mark stepped forward, handcuffing her as Daniel lay sobbing on the floor. October 22nd. Eleanor sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room, her wrists bound in cold steel. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. She stared at the table, her mind a whirlwind of memories, of love, betrayal, and the crimes she had committed. Across the glass window, Deputy Mark Tanner and another detective watched, their faces grim. Daniel West, still shaken from the confrontation at the cabin, was in a separate room. He had given a full confession, recounting every detail of the twisted path they had taken, beginning with the murder of Michael Reeves, the cover-up, and the desperate measures that led to the death of Sheriff Tom Willis. For the first time in days, Daniel's eyes seemed clear, but the weight of his words crushed him. There would be no redemption. Mark Tanner stepped into the room, his expression hard. He dropped a folder onto the table, the contents spilling out. Photos, evidence, a life laid bare. "You know why you're here, Eleanor?" he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the table. Mark leaned in. "It's over. We have everything. You can either cooperate or make this worse for yourself." Eleanor met his eyes, her own filled with exhaustion. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice hollow. "It does," Mark replied. "For the people you hurt, for the truth." October 24th. The trial moved swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming, and Eleanor's stoic silence spoke volumes. Daniel's testimony sealed their fate, detailing every desperate decision, every dark secret. The courtroom was packed, the air tense with a mix of shock and morbid fascination. This was more than just a case. It was the unraveling of a legacy. Eleanor listened as the prosecutor painted her as a cold, calculating woman driven by greed and fear. She felt every word like a knife, but she remained silent. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, every movement deliberate. "I made choices I can never take back," she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I hurt people I cared about. I betrayed trust, and I will live with that until the day I die." The judge's gavel came down hard. Eleanor and Daniel were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town of Cedar Pines, once captivated by the Price family's wealth and influence, turned away in collective shame and sorrow. Eleanor Price, once a powerful widow, had become a symbol of corruption and the cost of ambition. November 1st. Eleanor adjusted to her new life behind bars. The cold walls of the prison were a stark contrast to the luxury she had once known. Each day was a reminder of the choices that had led her here. Daniel, kept in a separate wing, had retreated into silence. They would never see each other again. But Eleanor's story didn't end there. Letters began arriving, anonymous messages that spoke of unfinished business. Someone knew more than they had let on. The threats were real, even from behind bars. Eleanor realized that the tangled web she had woven had far-reaching consequences, and others were still pulling the strings. One evening, as she sat in her cell, a guard approached. "You have a visitor," he said, his tone unreadable. Eleanor's heart pounded. She followed him to the visitor's room, unsure of what to expect. On the other side of the glass sat a man she didn't recognize, his face partially obscured by shadows. He leaned in, a chilling smile on his lips. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She realized then that the past had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. The town of Cedar Pines moved on, but the scars of the Price scandal remained. Stories were whispered of Eleanor's downfall and the tangled web of deceit and murder that had brought her low. For those who remembered, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how ambition, betrayal, and desperation could destroy even the mightiest among them. And in her cell, Eleanor Price sat alone, haunted by the ghosts of her past and the knowledge that her story was far from over.